This meeting's being live streamed.
We all have to be on at first. Sorry.
Make sure I mute that. Should just be able to close that, right, David, this window?
Minimize, just, I think, I don't know if it has to stay open or not.
All right. Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. We're just going to give it a minute here for people to join. All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the Division of Real Estate's HOA Forum. Today's Friday, October 27th, 2023. Today's HOA Forum is on reserve funds. This is the Colorado HOA Information and Resource Center. My name is Nick Altman. Thank you very much for joining. I also have, just making sure I'm not on mute, I also have Amanda Lopez here with me. Hey, Amanda.
Hey, guys. Thank you so much for joining. And happy Friday.
Awesome. Audio sounds good. And we also have David Donnelly, Education, Communication, and Policy Manager with us. Hey, David.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Nick, I just put a couple important bits and pieces of information into the chat for everyone, including contact information where you can find this recording later, as well as some information that people might be interested in regarding the HOA Homeowners Rights Task Force that was created by House Bill 23-1105. So everyone, you can feel free to copy and paste that out of the chat and then keep those resources for a little bit later. Thanks so much. Looking forward to this presentation very much, Nick.
Awesome. Thank you, David. I'm sure I always forget to do that. Thank you for posting that in the chat. Just so all our attendees know, the chat function's enabled, so feel free to post your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them live. Amanda is going to help us out in monitoring the chat. And also, David and I definitely coordinated ties today, so I hope everyone's okay with our coordination. All right, so moving on here. So most of you already know what we do, but I just wanted to reiterate what the HOA Center does do. We provide information to homeowners regarding their basic rights and responsibilities under the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act, which is commonly abbreviated KIOA. We gather, analyze, and report information through complaints and HOA registrations. We create resource materials. We provide education and forums. We provide a website with information for the public. We register HOAs pursuant to Section 33.3-401 of the Colorado Revised Statutes. And finally, we provide an annual report to the state legislature, usually around the spring. What we do not do, we do not act as a regulatory program. We do not mediate or arbitrate. We cannot provide legal advice. We do not act as an advocate. We cannot assess fines or penalties, and we do not enforce an HOA's failure to register with the division. Just as a quick disclaimer, the information in this presentation is for educational purposes only. By no means am I an expert in reserve studies. This is just intended as a high-level overview to kind of get a good handle on what are the reserve funds and what is a reserve study. None of the information should be construed as legal or financial advice. Any legal or financial questions you may have should be directed to an attorney or qualified professional in Colorado. And just as a quick update on House Bill 23-1105, the best way to make your story or experiences heard is by visiting Dora's Engagement HQ website that was created to accept feedback from the public on the Homeowners Rights Task Force. And here's a link in the presentation in case you're not familiar with that website. So just to respect your time today, our talking points will be a couple of important definitions and concepts concerning reserve funds in an HOA. What are the statutory requirements? I'll show you a reserve study example and kind of what they look like and what to expect. I'll talk about some previous legislative efforts in the state of Colorado to implement reserve studies. We'll talk a little bit about industry best practices. And finally, I've included some HOA Center pro tips. I'm going to throw a quick poll up here just to see who's joining us today. You should be able to see a poll on your screen. The question is, who's joining us today? Are you a homeowner, a community association manager, a board member, or attorney, realtor, or other party? I'll share these results here too. Looks like the majority of attendees today are board members, which is great, followed by homeowners. See if I can share that. You should be able to see the results here. About 65% board members, 39% homeowners, and so on and so forth. Get rid of that. All right, moving on. So let's go over some definitions and concepts here. So what is the HOA reserve account? So the reserve account is an HOA's reserve account is the account dedicated to the unanticipated and deferred expenditures an association might face, especially the larger ones. The association allocates money towards its reserve account over time so that when a costly repair or financial outlay becomes necessary, the cash reserves are available to handle the expense without sacrificing the day-to-day functions of the association. So what's a reserve study? A reserve study is an examination conducted by typically a reserve specialist, a consultant, or an accounting firm for the purpose of analyzing any probable long-term expenses, and keyword probable. So the reserve analysis is then used to estimate the association's reserve needs as accurately as possible. It's an educated estimate as to how much an association should contribute to the reserve account in order to meet those unplanned large expenses in the future. Importantly, it is not a guarantee of future events. It's just a best guess estimate. So what's the difference between reserve funds and reserve expenses? So reserve funds are, again, the funds the association sets aside to cover the costs for replacement or significant repair of the major common area elements or components that the association is responsible for maintaining. Now, reserve expenses are the expenses incurred by the association as a result of such replacement or repairs. Note, reserve should be separate from the regular maintenance items. So for example, I put a picture of a rain gutter or downspout, rain gutter there. The regular maintenance, like cleaning out the leaves and just kind of the day-to-day maintenance would not be considered a reserve expense. However, if the association were to replace all of the rain gutters or downspouts in the community, that would be considered a reserve expense. So I included some definitions from HOA that I thought were relevant to reserve funds. So let's go over common elements. And again, CCIOA, that's the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act. This is section 38-33.3-103. And from here out in the presentation, I'll just refer to section 103, which is the ending section of Kiowa, just for simplicity's sake. So 103 here, definition number 5. So if it's a portion of the unit, it's not a common element according to Kiowa, although it might be a limited common element. If it's real estate that's not owned or leased by the association, it's not a common element. Hope that makes sense. Let's go over another definition. Limited common element, also section 103 in the definitions list of Kiowa. This is definition number 19. So in order for it to be a limited common element, the common element must be allocated by the declaration or by virtue of it being a component listed in sections 1B or 1D here on your screen, for the exclusive use of one or more units, but fewer than all of the units. So for example, there might be a portion of a duct, like an air duct, serving one condo unit owner, say on the 5th floor, while the rest of that air duct serves the fitness center on that same 5th floor. The portion of the duct serving the unit owner is a limited common element, while the rest of the portion is considered part of the common elements of the community. Similarly, a condo unit might have a balcony, which is more common, that serves just that one condo unit, but is not located within the boundaries of the unit. That balcony would also be considered a limited common element allocated exclusively to that unit under this definition. Common expenses, definition item number 7. Allocation to reserves are considered a common expense line item on the budget, and I included a sample HOA budget here. You can see that any allocations or contributions to the reserve account should be listed under the expense item under the expense items on the budget. So here you can see for this particular sample HOA, they have allocated $28,800 to the reserve account for calendar year 2020. Typically, you'll see it at the end of the budget, just like this, at the bottom of the expenses. What are the types of association budget accounts? Well, you have the operating account, which includes fixed annual expenses, such as your heavy hitters like management fees, maintenance fees, utilities, etc. These are predictable expenses that the association knows will come up and expects will just be recurring regular fees. However, the reserve account is the account reserved for capital expense items such as asphalt, roofing, fencing, mechanical equipment that don't normally occur on an annual basis. So these are the larger unplanned expense items that an association might account for or should account for. So sometimes in Kiowa, we see what's considered a language that mentions a physical and financial analysis, and I'll point to this a little bit later here. But basically, a physical analysis is how are the components doing in the community? What does the sprinkler system look like? What's the maintenance condition of the swimming pool? It's the physical status and replacement cost of the common elements that the association is responsible for maintaining. The financial analysis is just that, a financial analysis of the balance sheet, the income and expense statements, and any other financial statements the HOA might have. All right, so I'm going to get a little bit into statutory requirements here. Just want to see if there's any questions we can answer here. Amanda, anything catching your eye?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I was gonna stop you here in a few minutes just to ask some questions that were in there. We can definitely go over them. Let's look at the first few. First one we have was from Tracy. We would like to add a fee to the sale of properties that will go directly into our reserve fund. The property status requests that we receive from the title companies typically have a space for this. Is there anything we need to know about this? Any restrictions on the amounts? We would like to make our amount $400 per sale while still keeping our transfer fee of $100.
Nick, if I can take that one, for that person asking that question, this tends to be a common question that comes up, and so I want to make sure that I can give you a citation to the Colorado Nonprofit Corporation Act, which does permit these types of charges. The citation is Colorado Revised Statutes, CRS, then it's 7-123-102. So while we cannot speak to the reasonableness of those fees, we can't say is $1,000 right, is $50 right. That's ultimately left up to you and maybe perhaps finally a judge. But keep that in mind, that those types of costs, as they increase, if they are not really serving a specific purpose other than just to go into savings, you will certainly have numerous unhappy homeowners in your community. Both buyers and sellers will be unhappy about this. So please try to keep that in mind when you're considering those types of additional fees. Furthermore, any fees such as that will need to be included in your governance policies that are required by Kiowa. So make sure that you consult with your counsel, with your lawyer for the association in order to consider that if your board decides that they'd like to implement something of that sort.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, David. Let me jump in here, see if I can answer Orlando's question. Can the reserve account be used for a 100% increase in insurance? I think that should probably be accounted for in the operating account, as opposed to the reserve account, which should just be for the big ticket maintenance items, like replacing the boiler, replacing the heating, the swimming pool heating pump, or the irrigation system. So I think, I know there's a lot of in the insurance right now, the premiums are skyrocketing, and a lot of HOAs are struggling to secure property insurance for the HOAs. But short answer, I would probably say no. That should be reserved for the operating expense account.
Nick, with regards to what that can cover, Jason Cruz wants to know if reserve funds can be used for legal fees.
Again, probably not. David, what do you think of that? He's on mute.
Mute, I apologize. Generally speaking, I mean, based on the description and the definition that Nick provided in the slides, it can be. However, your association should carefully consider budgeting for attorney's fees. The vast majority of your associations will have at least a modicum of attorney's fees on an annual basis that should be budgeted for. However, if something comes up, for instance, a hailstorm, and you need to retain counsel in order to work through the insurance claim, that's something that could be put into an unexpected expense, just like my boiler just died on me. So while budgeting should be considered in your budget formulations, those expenses can be used if necessary. Yes.
Right. If necessary, like, of course you can always use it, right, for expenses, but it's kind of recommended or suggested that you set those aside for the replacement cost items. But of course, you got to find the money somewhere. So yeah, if you have to pay for it. All right, let me kind of continue on here. I know there's a couple more questions in there, but I'm going to try and continue with the presentation. So the next couple slides are the actual statutory language that relate to reserve funds, just so everyone knows. And the bolded italicized text here that you see is the actual language found in Kiowa. So beginning with kind of like the beginning of Kiowa, what comes up first concerning reserve funds? So section 209.4 here. So associations in Colorado are required to annually disclose certain information within 90 days after the end of each fiscal year. There's quite a long list of information that they have to disclose, but item D here states that it must disclose its annual financial statements, including any amounts held in reserve for the fiscal year immediately preceding the current annual disclosure. So the HOA must disclose any amounts held in reserve for the fiscal year immediately preceding that year. How is it supposed to do that? Well, it can post on its website. It can create a literature table or binder at the HOA principal place of business. It can send it out by US mail or personal delivery. So that's section 209.4. Moving on to section 209.5 here, responsible governance policies. HOAs in Colorado have to have 9 governance policies. They must have 9 governance policies. The 6th policy here in Roman numeral 6 is concerning the investment of reserve funds. So that's pretty straightforward. It should just be a policy explaining how are we going to invest the reserve funds? What can we do? What can we not do? The policy should outline what type of financial institutions or vehicles that the reserve funds may be invested in. Probably something like how much risk are we willing to accept here, or concerning those reserve funds. Generally speaking, it shouldn't be that much, or a very low risk level. And maybe your policy might say, again, all HOA policies are different, but yours might say, what is the minimum amount of funds that we should invest, or that may be set aside for investment? I've seen some policies say up to 40% of the reserve account may be invested in an FDIC insured money market savings account, for example. To my knowledge, I'm not aware of any declaration that would permit the investment of Bitcoin or non-fungible tokens, for example. All right, so the 9th required policy here in Roman numeral 9, it's a bit trickier to understand, but it's not that bad. Basically, it's just saying that it's basically granting HOAs the right to prepare a reserve study. So if the association chooses to conduct a reserve study, it must notate how frequently it conducts a reserve study in its policy. So it needs to specify whether there's a funding plan for the work recommended, such as how are we going to get the funds, right? Special assessments, maybe we're going to get a bank loan or some other means, or just raising dues. It also must specify whether the reserve study is based on a physical and financial analysis, which I previously discussed. Then it says, for purposes of this subparagraph 9, an internally conducted reserve study shall be sufficient. So the statute does not require the HOA to conduct a reserve study. And also it does not require the HOA to retain the services of a third-party company, for example, to conduct a reserve study. All right, moving on, section 302 of Kiowa, powers of unit owners association. So HOAs have the power to adopt and amend budgets. If the association in its reasonable diligence determines that they need more money to be set aside for capital expenditures, they may levy a special assessment on the membership base. There's nothing in state statute that would prohibit that. However, they are subject to the association's governing documents. I would say most HOAs in Colorado require a membership vote to levy a special assessment. Again, that power is expressly granted here in section 302. And the reason why I included this was so they have the ability to modify reserves. Let me just see if any questions here. Please state the difference between a reserve review versus a reserve study. It's there's nothing in state statute that defines that. Some industry professionals or companies will probably differentiate that. A review is literally just going over your most recent reserve study, reviewing the components to see how accurate the costs are, or whether costs have increased recently compared to the study, which is actually the HOA is paying for a brand new reserve study.
I have a good question here, Nick. It's from Nick Oros. If a declarant transfers control of the HOA board without a reserve study, what should the appointed board or subsequent boards do to ensure compliance?
All right, so I'm gonna try and unbury that question a little bit. I think you might be referring to a House bill that was tried to pass in 2022. I think it was 1387. That bill would have required the declarants or the developer to actually conduct a reserve study prior to transferring the control over to the membership base. However, that bill was not passed, so there's no requirement that a declarant conduct a reserve study. And of course, David will correct me if I'm making stuff out here. All right, let's move on here. Section 303, executive board members and officers. This one's stating basically whoever's in charge of the investment of reserve funds. So it could be the HOA treasurer, a CAM, usually a community manager, an attorney could be in charge, or even the entire executive board. Whoever's in charge of investing those reserve funds are subject to the standards set forth in the Colorado Nonprofit Corporation Act. That is Colorado Revised Statute 7-128-401. If you have not read that, I highly encourage you to read it. Basically, what Kiowa here is saying, all right, so we're going to substitute certain terms that we see in the Colorado Revised Nonprofit Act into Kiowa. So if you see the word corporation or nonprofit, it actually means, yes, the association. If you see director, that means a member of the association's executive board. Same with officer. And an officer of an HOA, as we all know, could be a managing agent, an attorney, or an accountant employed by the executive board. So what are these duties? What are they subject to? So according to the Colorado Revised Nonprofit Corporation Act, that's the last time I'm going to say that. It's a hard word to say. Board members, any officers must act in good faith. They must act with the care an ordinarily prudent person in a like position would exercise under similar circumstances, and they must act in a manner the director or officer reasonably believes to be in the best interest of the nonprofit corporation. So if the HOA president is taking the reserve funds to purchase a Lamborghini, one might make the argument that he's not acting in good faith. If you have any questions about this, I would recommend contacting a licensed attorney. All right, what is bylaws? What about bylaws? Section 306 of Kiowa. So this section is basically saying that if an HOA has 30 or more units and delegates financial authority to a CAM, a community manager, or to any other persons, then that person must maintain all funds and accounts of the association separate from the funds and accounts of any other association they manage. The accounts have to be separate. Not only that, but they must maintain all reserve accounts of each association separate from the operational accounts of the association. So there must be a clear line between the operational account and the reserve account. Now, this section is not actually really applicable to reserve funds, but I thought I would include it just because I thought it was important. It's saying that the bylaws must provide that an annual accounting for association funds and a financial statement be prepared and presented to the association by the managing agent, a public accountant, or a certified public accountant. Annually. Okay, insurance. I will be the first to admit this is a difficult section to understand in Kiowa. If you have any questions or concerns about HOA insurance, I would advise you to speak with your insurance agent or your HOA attorney if you have one. But basically, in a nutshell, this is saying the cost of repair or replacement in excess of insurance proceeds and reserves is a common expense. If any unit owner or employee of an association with 30 or more units controls or disperses funds, the HOA has to maintain, to the extent reasonably available, fidelity insurance. there's a formula here, but basically it's saying coverage shall not be less in aggregate than 2 months current assessments plus reserves as calculated from the current budget of the HOA. So just a quick example here. Suppose that you have an 18-unit condominium building with monthly assessments of $400 per unit owner. 18 times 400 times 2 would be $14,400. So if the HOA reserve account has $80,000 in it, the fidelity bond requirements would need to be more than $94,400. 18 there represents the number of units in this hypothetical scenario. Let me see if there's any other questions here. Let's see, David, maybe you can handle this one. What about Rob here? What about roads that the HOA maintains and that the HOA dues includes funds to maintain?
Much like a lot of the other questions that we've received in the chat are that you should expect as an association that you will have an annual amount budgeted for maintenance. Now, if you have a storm come through and washes out a culvert in your road, that's an unexpected expense, would be a capital improvement that you would very likely pay from your reserve funds in order to finance the repair or replacement in that situation. So can you use reserve funds for that? Yes. Should associations assume that these things happen? Hail happens, storms happen, wear and tear happens, boilers break, roofs have a life, an extended life, or an expected life, excuse me. You should be planning for all of these things as an association. Wooden stairs and decks, they rot out. They don't live in perpetuity. So you should be planning for these expenses down the road. And that's exactly what Nick's been talking about, is that these reserve studies, if you have an engineer come on site and conduct a reserve study, they're going to look at your roof and say, it looks like you've got, we expect roofs to last 25 years, and you replaced this one 10 years ago. That means you've got 15 years to save up the money to replace that roof when we expect that it will die, when it will fail. Same type of thing. We should assume that some of these other accidents happen over time. That's what your reserve funds are for, is to protect your association in order to avoid special assessments. If we budget for these things, and even if it's $5 every month or $100 every month that we're putting from operating into reserves, it's a rainy day fund for those scenarios, those things that we know will happen in every one of your communities. I can't speak to which one of these is going to happen in your communities because every one of your communities is different. However, it will happen. And so boards should consider how to plan for that, because if I'm paying $100 a month now, that's much better than being dropped on with a $3,000, I need to pay this reserve, this special assessment to make this repair on an immediate basis. That's why we plan for the worst, hope for the best always. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's great. It seems like we've kept quite a bit of our attendees. I'm glad you all have stuck around. That's usually a good thing that I'm keeping your attention. So thank you. So Christy has a question here. What is the percentage average, or excuse me, what percent average do you consider of having a healthy reserve account for the state? Well, again, there's no state requirement. There's nothing defined in Kiowa that would say, hey, listen, HOA, you have to have this amount in your reserve account. But just in my experience and seeing some industry best practices and some of the companies out there, you might hear them say something like 30 to 40% of the budget should be devoted to reserve contributions, to planning for that rainy day. And again, that's just an industry best practice, but there's no required level.
There's a question from Penny, Nick. Is the board allowed to make decisions about how to use the funds without a vote from the membership?
It would just depend on the association governing documents, like what's laid out there. A lot of HOAs allow for the treasurer to make these decisions or to have this authority. You just have to check your specific bylaws or declaration. Roger, how often should an outside audit be done to validate the accuracy of the financial statements? It would depend on the needs of the community. Every community is different, so, and you know your community better than anyone. So if you know that some of your maintenance items are on the verge of breaking down, it might be a time to get an audit or to have a site visit, someone come down and take a look at your components there. But again, there's no set time frame for how often a audit should be done. All right, let me proceed here. Surplus funds. So the HOA Center, we do see questions sometimes about like, hey, our board, they've collected our dues. All our items are in great shape, or we don't have any maintenance concerns, which is, I don't know where you live, but that seems like an amazing place to live. Shouldn't the board credit or refund the surplus funds back to us? We get that question quite a bit here. Short answer is they could if the declaration allows them to do it, or if the declaration is silent, if there's nothing to say what should happen with any surplus funds, that the HOA may decide on their own to credit the funds back to the unit owners after payment of the common expenses and prepayment to reserves. I would say in most communities, though, that surplus funds should just be dropped into the reserve account, just for help with planning for expense items, large expense items. I would think most attorneys and most accountants would probably agree. The financial health of the community is probably what's most important. Association records, section 317. So as most of you already know, I'm sure, the association must produce certain records on unit owner request. If the associate, so section K here, there's a long list. I believe it's like A through R, something like that. Letter K, the association, if the association conducted a reserve study, it must be retained and produced to the unit owners, the most recent one. All right, so kind of summarizing some of the statutory notes here. So does Colorado require a reserve study be conducted? No, but the HOA must have a reserve policy. That policy can say something like, we're not going to do a reserve study. Is there a minimum amount that should be set aside for the reserve fund? Nothing set by the state, but industry best practices, again, as I mentioned, would say somewhere around 30 to 40% of the budget. So do we need to, or should we conduct a reserve study? Well, check your association governing documents, as it might be required, or at the very least, it might require that a reserve fund be established. So I'm just going to throw a quick reserve study example up here. So this might be, if you're to retain an accountant or a reserve specialist, you might see something like this. They're going to break down the assets in a list. For example, the roof, the rain gutters, concrete, asphalt repair, the monument sign, mailboxes, etc. You might see something like UL and RUL, which is the useful life and the remaining useful life of that component. Then you'll see the way to kind of explain this simply is they might say, hey, listen, HOA, this monument sign that you have has a useful life of 18 years, according to our engineer report or according to our contractor. You have 3 years remaining on this monument before complete failure or collapse. The cost to replace that in 3 years will be $8,875. You should allocate $493 per unit owner into your reserve account if you want to replace the monument in 3 years from now. And as you can see, that's less than 1% of the recommended reserve account percentage. So I thought that just might be helpful. So then I came up with some projections. Again, do not use this as your own reserve study. It's just as an example only. But you might see something like, okay, well, the projected starting balance of January 1st, 2024 in the reserve account, according to how things are going now, according to your operations now, should be about $405,000. We, as an accountant or reserve company, suggest or recommend that that balance should be $965,000. Right now, you're only at 42% funded. Or come January 1st, you will be only 42% funded of our recommendations. So therefore, we think that you should raise a special assessment of $75 per unit home. That is Nick Altman's reserve projection sample. Please do not use that as an actual example. I'm not sure of my numbers there. So, all right. So then you might also include an analysis like, oh, you're 0 to 25% funded. The HOA is in a red or a weak financial position. 66 to 98% funded might be a green or a strong position. I think what's important here, if your reserve account's not very well funded, the association should be, or it might be at a high level, a high risk of levying a special assessment, or they should, to avoid some kind of catastrophe with the common elements. Most HOAs are not 100% funded. I think you'll probably hear that most HOAs are maybe, if on a good day, are 50% funded, but I don't think no one can account for economic and financial uncertainties in our market. Amanda, anything else?
Well, we did have some, I'm kind of going more towards like the bottom. I know we went over a lot of the first few, some that have came in. Let's see, we have some scenarios. We're going to go over that. Judy wants to know, can reserve funds be used for a reserve study?
They could be. Yeah, they could be, but it's probably advised not to. It's probably recommended against doing that.
Okay, thank you. Can interest earned on a reserve fund be used for operational expenses?
I'm going to say yes, they can, but you might want to talk with a tax professional because there could be implications on how that interest may be used from an operational standpoint.
Thank you.
Let me just go in here. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Did we go over Megan's question? I can't recall. What's the rule of thumb for how much you should have in reserves? Is it based on a percentage?
Yeah,
okay.
Industry professionals would probably say somewhere around 30 to 40%.
Okay, thank you.
Let me move on here. So what about investing the reserve funds? Again, there must be a policy in place.
It's 30 to 40% of your annual budget. Just wanted to clarify that real quick. Sorry. Please go right ahead.
Thank you for that clarification, David. So concerning investing the reserve funds, again, there must be a policy in place on how the HOA invests those funds. It's advisable that the board invest the funds as a prudent investor would, using sound business judgment, or they have a fiduciary duty to invest those funds wisely. Many HOAs choose FDIC insured bank accounts. If you have more than 250,000 in your reserve fund, you might consider going to another bank or using another bank to secure the FDIC insurance. And also, just as a best practice, shop around. Right now, insurance rates are higher for savings accounts and money markets. So just look around, ask around, see who's offering the best rates. And also consider that that bank has knowledge about how to open a nonprofit bank account, and see if they have knowledge about HOAs before you open an account. Just as a small tip there. Okay, so there was just one legislative effort and I kind of already went over that, but it was House Bill 22-1387, which did not become law. The title of this bill was Common Interest Communities Reserve Funds. At a high level, this bill would have required a minimum level reserve funds to be devoted to the replacement of the components. It would have required the developer to obtain a reserve study prior to transferring control over to the homeowners. And also it would have required a reserve study be provided to potential purchasers of units in a common interest community in the seller's disclosures. And it would have required the declarant to provide a reserve study. I just said that, yeah, at the time that the transfer of control occurs. It would have also defined a couple of definitions, emergent life circumstances. So it would have given the board authority to raise dues in special circumstances, which would have warranted dangerous conditions if the current reserve funds were not adequate to address those concerns. And then finally, it would have limited the investment of reserve funds in financial instruments that are not insured by a federal agency. So again, that bill did not become law, and that was in the 2022 General Assembly session. Coming on, I got about maybe 5 more slides just so everyone knows here. So industry best practices, again, that reserve contribution amount should, you might hear professionals say, around 20 to 40% of the association's total budget in financially healthy communities. The reserve studies should be reviewed on an annual basis. A new study should be conducted every 1 to 3 years, and probably an on-site visit should occur every 5 years. Have an engineer or a contractor come down to your community to actually put eyes on your common elements.
Nick, if I may, about the slide that you just switched from, I want everyone to listen, consider very carefully that we don't know the circumstances on the ground in your communities. Some of you live in 60-year-old communities. Some of you live in communities that were opened a week ago. And the needs and the requirements of those communities are very different. Some of your communities have pools. Other communities have next to no common element amenities. So these are all important considerations when assessing the needs of your specific community. That's why we can't say what you need. I'm not qualified for that. Amanda's not qualified for that. Nick's not qualified for that. However, there are professionals out there in the world that can assist a board with these types of items. They can look at your budgets, they can look at your past expenditures, and they can look at the condition of your properties at the current time. So those are some really important things to think about. I know that everybody here would love it if we could give you bright line rules, and I wish so too. But the reality is that each of your communities is different, and that needs to be taken into consideration by each of your respective boards when making these plans, thinking about what is next, how much money should we be at 20%? Should we be at 40%? Should we have that on-site review maybe every 2 years instead of every 5 years? Lots of things to think about there. So again, that's only food for thought as you guys bring this back to your respective boards and your respective communities to think about.
Thank you, David. Yeah. All right, so finally, some HOA Center pro tips here. All right, so if you're a homeowner on this call, it's highly recommended that you attend your board and annual member meetings. I don't know how to stress this enough. If there is a way to, I don't want to say force homeowners to attend their meetings, but if we can include more homeowners in the meetings, they can understand what's going on with their budget and understand, hey, oh, now I understand why a special assessment is needed or why the dues were raised. So attend your meetings, ask questions about the HOA reserve account, ask questions about your swimming pool, your clubhouse, the furniture, like, hey, is there a plan to replace this? Or when do you think we should be replacing these common elements? If you're aware of any maintenance concerns, if you're walking down the street and you see your mailbox is falling apart, raise it to the attention of your board of directors. Don't assume someone else will do it. Also, it's entirely possible board members are volunteers. They're volunteering their time to care for their community. Most of the time it's not a paid position, so throw them a bone sometimes, I'm sure they're trying their best most of the time. They care about their community as much as you do as a homeowner. So maybe direct them to resources where they might learn more about being on an executive board of directors, like HOA, for example, or God forbid, the HOA center. If you're a homeowner, if you're knowledgeable about finance and HOA operations, offer to volunteer your time to possibly serve on a committee of the board. I'm sure they would definitely appreciate your expertise. And finally, just as a general rule of thumb, most everything is increasing in cost. If your dues haven't been raised in a while, it's not a concern, but it might be a concern. So you might want to ask, hey, how are we paying for things? Or, how are dues still remaining so low? If you're a board member on this call, if you have an underfunded reserve account, consider raising those dues. Most people do not like when the dues are raised, but if you're transparent and communicate with your homeowners, explain to them, hey, Colorado weather, Mother Nature, winter's coming up. We had a record year for snow last year in Steamboat Springs, I think it was. Just explain it, be transparent, and explain the need for those additional funds. Plan ahead, communicate with your fellow board members, open up discourse, open up a dialogue, and make sure you're following your governing documents. If you're making transfers or increasing or decreasing the deposit amount, make sure that it's in accordance with your governing documents. Also, you might consider, we don't endorse reserve studies, but you might want to pay for a reserve study. Go talk to a lawyer, talk to an accountant, or a couple of reserve specialist companies in Denver specialize in this sort of thing. Consider getting a reserve study. Finally, board members might be held liable. I don't mean to include this to scare you or anything, but board members could be held liable for their failure to act as a breach of fiduciary duty. And then if you're a CAM on this call, make sure you're properly advising your client for the need of adequately funding the reserve account. It's probably one of the most important things in an HOA. And also CAMs may also be held liable for breach of contractual responsibility. Okay, so that wraps up the presentation. We can go over a couple more questions. It's about 10 minutes to 2. I'm happy sticking around, seeing if I can answer any additional questions here. Here's a link to our, if you wanted to email me a question, you can use the Dora _Dre_HOA inquiries at state.co.us. I know it's kind of hard to see there with the underline, but there are 2 underscores there. That's the link to our website. And also I'm a fan of our FAQ section. There's a lot of great information and resources there to learn about HOAs and duties and responsibilities of the board and all sorts of other things on that website. All right, so let me just see if there's any questions here. Susan, our HOA of 5 units has never had reserve funds. Are they required legally? Well, I think I did have a slide there that said, yes, there should be an established reserve fund. Let me see if I might be able to find that. Maybe. But I mean, consider speaking with counsel, legal counsel. If you don't have a reserve fund, consider talking with them to see if your particular community needs one. Michael, is it advised to keep both an operating account and reserve account, or can a small association just maintain an operating account? You should have both an operating and a reserve account. Helen, Amanda's microphone is kind of fuzzy. Thank you for the feedback. Brenda, can reserve funds be used for paying insurance premiums? Again, I don't think, unless your governing documents prohibit the use of reserve funds for any particular reason, there's nothing that would stop you from, in an emergency, to use the reserve funds for that purpose. What if owners prefer to use special assessments rather than building a large reserve account? I mean, that would be great. I mean, I don't think most homeowners would not want a special assessment, but if they prefer a special assessment, then all the power to them. Ed, maybe they should not, this might just be a comment, maybe they should not be used, but what if it avoids a special assessment and the amount is made up in the next budget? What if it avoids a special assessment? I don't know if I understand that question, Ed. Feel free to email me and I'll see if I can get a better answer for you. What would you assess the insurance? David and Amanda, if you want to jump in, feel free. I'm just kind of going through these. Would you?
Yeah, I'm going through them too. I'll definitely come in and ask. You're asking a lot of, you're answering the questions that I'm about to ask you. That you're reading the ones that I want to read you.
I've got one here. Janet referenced HB 221137. That bill was not vetoed. 1137 is a different bill. The bill that Nick referred to in the slides here is HB 221387, I think, Nick.
Yeah, I'll get to it.
Forgive me. But that bill was vetoed. That it doesn't speak to the allowing or disallowing reserve assessments. What it did was it would have, had it passed, it would have imposed certain requirements on associations to conduct reserve studies at certain times, as well as required certain types of liquidity, which some of the other questions here have come about so far, or in the chat have chatted about. But again, there are currently no requirements about that liquidity. However, all board members should carefully consider, and there's some great comments in here talking about if you're going to invest in CDs, have graduated or varying maturity dates, for instance, so that you do have some liquidity in that. If it's all tied up in something like a certificate of deposit that is 5 years or 10 years or whatever maturity rate, and you can't get it out with significant penalties, that's not a great plan. But again, so always having some of this in a cash operating account, a savings account essentially is what I'm talking about in your financial institution, but be it a credit union or a bank, is perfectly fine. It certainly is important to consider, as Nick mentioned, the FDIC insurance limits on some of these, because some of your communities, I've spoken to people that have $5 million in their reserve accounts. That is wonderful, but if it's all, if that bank, if you have it all in one financial institution, that might not be the best idea. So you can spread that out. Again, we're not financial advisors. We can't give you that type of advice. Speak to a financial advisor, speak to your accountants about what some of your best practices should be. Should you have a pile of $5 million in sitting somewhere, for instance? Those are important questions, and lots of things that boards that are in that circumstance should carefully consider how they approach it.
Glenn asked, are financial statements to be prepared in compliance with generally accepted accounting principles? No, I don't think so, at least for reserve funds purposes. But if there's a unit owner requested audit, I do think there's a requirement there. I believe let's say about 88% certain that the whoever prepares the financial statements has to have a basic understanding or elementary education of finance and financial principles. Do reserve funds have to be deposited in the FDIC? They don't have to be, but it's probably the wisest decision.
Orlando wants to know, Nick, if you can give an example of a 30% of budget allocation for reserve.
I mean, so if the assessments for like calendar year 2022 were say $200,000, you collected as an HOA $200,000 from your unit owners. 40% of those assessments in an ideal world should be allocated to the reserve funds. So account. So was that $80,000? I think. Susan, yeah, from my experience, the study is more in depth and costs more. There are like certain tiers that I've seen that the companies are charging for certain services or levels of analysis. You just have to talk with that particular company. Don, regarding the investment of reserve funds, we've been paying income tax on the reserves, which seems entirely wrong. We've been told that since our HOA is not for housing, but for warehouses, like a small business complex, that we must pay tax on the reserves deposited and on the return on the invested funds. This is a disincentive to build the reserve fund. I would say talk with a tax professional. I think the IRS actually has a website dedicated to nonprofit association tax returns. So you might consider checking out the IRS website. I can't think of the form number off the top of my head, but I know for sure there's information on there. It's a lot of questions. Trying to get through them. Let's see. Is some or all of what is being presented applicable to developer metro special districts? HOAs are subject to Kiowa. Metro districts are subject to, I think it's Title 12. Yep. Thank you, David. Metros, they're not the same type of legal entity. They have different laws, different requirements. Can you define units? The way I define unit is looking at the declaration plat map. The developer knows how many units that he built. So the declaration plat map should identify your units, how many units are in the HOA, and the boundaries of that unit. If you guys see any interesting questions, feel free to interrupt. In self-managed, yes, go ahead, Amanda.
Sorry, thanks. Mary has a question. She says, do you think the HOA homeowners rights task force will be recommending new requirements for reserves?
I can't speak on behalf of the HOA task force. If you have any comment or suggestions, we would encourage you to use the DORA Engagement HQ website. I can put it back up here on the screen again. Our HOA only has 25 units. Seems like most of the rules are for 30 units or more, just at least for the one requirement, which I forgot already. I think it was the fidelity bond requirements, if I'm not mistaken, are only applicable to the 30 units or more. Or if the HOA delegates financial authority to a managing agent or a manager. We will put the slides up on our website probably Monday or Tuesday next week. I hope everybody knows how to access our previous HOA forums, because we've been doing this for about a year and a half, maybe almost 2 years, David.
Mm-hmm.
Once it's posted, I'm happy to send it to you. If you just email it to me, I can email you a copy of the slides. Seems like a lot of the questions I've answered already. Can consider a special assessment to cover an insurance claim deductible and costs in excess of the claim settlement. Does that need to be voted on by the entire membership or only the board? I think the requirements are going to be found in your governing documents. And also Kiowa has a provision where it allows boards to adopt non-discriminatory policies surrounding the submittal of a claim for the HOA insurance. So there most likely will be a policy on who can submit a claim, and yeah. Our HOA bylaws state reserves must always maintain a balance of $4,500 in 1987 dollars. Wouldn't it be fiscally prudent for the board to be using current values in order to keep up with inflation? Yes, it would be prudent. You might consider looking at the CPI, the Consumer Pricing Index, to see to look at some of those indices to see how are we going to keep up with the cost of inflation. Yeah, I mean, Deidre, why can't reserve funds be used for a reserve study if it's not, if it is for a specific reserve? You just said recommended not, just because the reserve funds should just be used for maintenance replacement cost items. Can the HOA transfer funds from reserves to operating account? Yes, assuming it's provided for in your documents. How many more we got here? Let's see if I can get through some more, couple more here. If your community has anticipated large maintenance expenses, such as roofing, concrete, etc., in the near future, should those expenses come from a reserve or a special assessment? Probably yes. Yes, they should come from the reserve fund. Or if the HOA doesn't have enough in the reserve fund, they might consider raising a special assessment or taking out a loan from a bank or raising dues. What about an HOA board that refuses to get professional advice? They make up their own rules. Attend the meetings and make your own voice heard is kind of the best advice I got for you there. Are HOA maintained roads considered a common element? If it says so in your declaration. Resource center. Can the HOA Resource Center furnish cost of construction index for various areas of the state? That would just be the consumer pricing index from who's the government? David, do you know who the federal agency is that handles the CPI? I think is it I can't think off the top of my head, but it's public knowledge.
Unfortunately, I don't know. In the chat there, Nick, in regards to that question, I did mention that a bill passed in the 2023 session, which is going to require a replacement cost analysis be conducted on an annual basis, with the first one being due April 1st of 2024. So it does not exist now. However, it will in the future. Again, this is a replacement cost for insurance purposes. And that report is specifically directed to consider various types of construction, as well as the geographic variability of our great state. Therefore, there's lots to digest in that, but we don't have any information on that because we don't work directly with vendors of the sort like that. But that report, once it becomes available, might be something that you'd be interested in viewing to consider the varying costs of replacement in the state of Colorado.
Is there a point where non-reserve funds, i.e. operating funds, become excessive? For example, if the association's annual regular operating budget was $250K, but the checking account never goes below, say, $50,000, is that an issue? Assume all reserve funds are properly funded. I don't think it would be an issue. You might consider making sure that those funds are federally insured and FDIC account. But that's a great HOA. That's a great HOA you live in. Yep, you mentioned there are professionals to help assess. What credentials do we look for? There are a variety of credentials out there. I know reserve specialist is a credential. I think it's CAI offers that credential, so you might consider reaching out to CAI. That stands for Community Association Institute. Rocky Mountain chapter, I think. Small. Let's see. All right, 3 more minutes, and then I'm going to call it. Can an HOA borrow from the reserve fund for operating expense? Yes, unless your document's prohibited. So, I mean, some small HOAs might be exempt from some of these requirements in Kiowa. You would just need to look at the specific section of Kiowa. I think it's section 117 that talks about the applicability of smaller communities and whether they're subject to Kiowa or not. Your HOA might be only subject to certain portions or none at all, or they might also elect to become subject to Kiowa. All right, I think I'm going to call it that there, y'all. Thanks a lot for attending. I appreciate you all coming. If you have any questions, here, I'll put the last slide up here with our email address again, just in case. We really appreciate you attending. And if you have any, if you have any questions, feel free to email. Oops, I just ended that, but Thanks again for attending, and we'll see you probably in November for, we're not quite sure what we're going to talk about, but we'll make sure and get our announcements out there. That way everybody knows what the HOA Center is up to. All right, so thanks again, everyone, for attending, and have a great weekend, and we'll see you soon.